This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
All right, welcome back. Right now, I want to talk about climate change. Is it real? Whether you call it climate change or global warming. And if it is, can humans do anything to stop it? That's an issue that my next guest has written about and spoken about extensively, including a recent column with his colleague Tim Ball. Tom Harris is Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, and I welcome him back to the show. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. How are you, Sean?
I'm very good, thank you. Now, just to tell our listeners a little bit about the column you wrote, fill our listeners in. Yourself and Tim Ball wrote about what you call a naive approach to climate change, and you kind of keyed off some comments that President Barack Obama made in Africa recently. Fill our listeners in.
Yeah, well, he was speaking at the Soweto campus of the University of Johannesburg, and what he said in response to a question about what was the U.S. doing about climate change, he didn't say anything about helping Africans adapt to climate change, prepare for climate change, like the increasing spread of deserts, that is putting 1 million children at risk in the Sahel, according to the UN. Instead, he spoke about how we're going to stop climate change. And, of course, the idea we can stop something that's been going on for billions of years is very much like King Canute, which is what we spoke about in our article.
King Canute, who, of course, had his throne, taken to the edge of the ocean and vowed to stop the tide coming in, and it kept coming in.
Yeah, exactly. But King Canute did that knowing the tide would come in. Many of his courtiers were trying to get promotions, I guess, and they were saying, the king is so great, he can stop the tide. Well, he wanted to show people that there were limits to his abilities, and so he specifically did this to teach them a lesson. The sad thing about Obama is that he's being led to believe that he can actually, or at least the United States, or humanity in general, can control the climate of planet Earth. And the problem with that, of course, is that most of the money now, $100 billion a year roughly, is going into climate finance, and most of that money, 95% of it, is being spent on the idea that we can stop climate change, while at the same time countries, like in the Sahel in Africa, are being basically starved of the support they need to adapt to real climate change.
$100 billion per year.
Yeah, that's how much they've tracked down. The Climate Policy Initiative out of San Francisco tracked down $100 billion, and they wanted to see how much was being spent on helping people today adapt to climate change versus helping people who might be affected generations in the future. And they found, unfortunately, that 95% of that $100 billion was going to the distant future.
Which, and if my math is right, is about $950 million.
Yeah, well, it's 95 billion actually.
It's a 95 billion. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
my math wasn't right.
Yeah, it's incredible amounts of money. And the sad thing is when the UN put out an appeal to get the money to save these million children in the Sahel region of Africa, many of the countries could not come up to the levels that UN wanted. And so children are dying today because they are focused, unfortunately, more on what might happen in future generations than what's happening today.
So you're saying adaptation to whatever is going on right now is a better strategy than trying to prevent global warming.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the science about climate change is so uncertain, we don't know how much effect we actually have. In fact, scientists now are starting to say that we may be headed for global cooling. So whatever happens, we know that we have to prepare for it. And a very good example is the Hurricane Sandy that hit New York City. During the time that hurricane was actually hitting, a lawyer was sitting in his office in Manhattan with full power, full electricity, full connectivity to the internet, and he was writing a letter to the New York Times. And what he said in the letter, because it was published, he said, look, here I am sitting in the middle of Hurricane Sandy, devastation around me, but Manhattan has its electrical and transmission communications cables buried underground. And that's an example, an excellent example of how you adapt to climate change.
Okay, but of course, your climate change advocates will say the existence of Hurricane Sandy is proof of climate change and that humans are causing it. Because I guess we've reached this tipping point, Tom Harris, of 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, that's what they would say. But the truth is, the science is out. I mean, we really don't know the future of climate. It's probably the most complex science we have ever tackled. I mean, people like Tim Ball actually believe that the CO2 does not cause warming. Other scientists believe it causes warming, but it's not a great deal. scientists behind closed doors, if you actually ask them, what's it going to be like in 20 years? They typically say, ask me in 20 years. We don't know. I mean, the 17 years of no warming that we've just experienced was not supposed to happen according to the models. And yet those computer models are what are driving the climate scare. So, our point of view is we don't know the future of climate. The science is too immature. But we do know that people need help now. So let's help them.
But I keep hearing from the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and others, Tom Harris, that the ocean is soon, I'm a couple hundred feet above sea level. I keep hearing that the ocean's soon going to be lapping at my doorstep, that all of our coastal cities are going to be flooded out in the next 50 to 100 years.
Well,
they know that. They absolutely know that.
Yeah, I know. It's a doctrine. It's a doctrine of certainty, as Professor McKittrick says from University of Guelph. But, it's anything but certain. I mean, the bottom line is that sea level has been rising since the end of the last glacial. And if you go back about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, sea level was rising 10 times faster than it is today. And in those days, people, for example, in the Middle East had to move their dwellings very quickly or their communities were submerged. But sea level now is much, much slower rise. It's something we can easily adapt to. But the idea that we can stop it or control it is very much a fairy tale, unfortunately.
Are you against any efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, though? I mean, is there any point to it in your mind to try to control, whether it's through a carbon tax or a cap and trade or greater fuel efficiency standards or whatever? Is there any good to be done by reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
I don't believe it's worthwhile. I think that it is worthwhile to reduce energy consumption, to improve efficiency, things like that. And you're going to have a concomitant reduction in CO2. But the trouble is some of the CO2 reduction plans actually increase your energy consumption and actually cause more pollution. And I'm talking about real pollution, not CO2.
How's that?
Well, take, for example, the sequestration of carbon dioxide underground.
Right.
Okay? That is something that takes a great deal of energy to collect your CO2, to compress it into a liquid, to pipe it long distances, pump it underground. You've got to build all those facilities. And so as a consequence, the net result is the efficiency of your power station goes way down, the cost of electricity goes way up, and you actually produce more pollution because of all these new devices you have to build and the energy you require to compress the CO2 and stuff it underground. So that's an example of a very stupid solution.
It's self-defeating.
Yeah, so what we're advocating are no-regrets approaches. In other words, approaches that are focused on reducing pollution where it's a problem and saving energy. And, whether we're causing climate change or not, that particular activity is worthwhile in itself. Now, that should please the people like David Suzuki because it also reduces CO2. But you really have to focus on the most important problem, and that is pollution and saving energy. And, yeah, if you get some CO2 reduction, I'm not against that, but you can't focus on that as your primary goal, or you're probably throwing your money down the drain.
Well, I for one, am very much in favor, and I admit, and I've said on this show before, and you've been on a few times, Tom, that I'm not completely convinced about anthropogenic global warming, that's a factor. But when it comes to greater fuel efficiency, greater energy efficiency, I see nothing wrong with that. I mean, whether you believe in peak oil or what have you, eventually fossil fuels will run out. I see no problem, for instance, with higher fuel efficiency standards for automobiles.
Yeah, I agree. I think that as an objective by itself is fine. But, you have to also be careful that you don't do the right thing for the wrong reasons because, that can get you into a lot of trouble. For example, the carbon sequestration idea is a big problem, and even people like Elizabeth May are against that. Just back to the Africa thing, I wanted to mention one thing really quickly. When I was in Copenhagen in 2009, the head of the African delegation and I were speaking, the people from Ethiopia. I shouldn't say his name, but he said, he pointed at the TV screen of all the protesters outside, and he said, these people are crazy. He says, they're all out there protesting what might happen decades in the future. My people need help today. And I asked him, I said, well, do you think we're causing dangerous climate change? He said, I don't know, but I do know that we need help now. And so, the whole focus of all this is backwards. So I talked to some of the junior delegates with the Ethiopian delegation, and I asked them the same thing. Do you think we're causing dangerous climate change? And even their scientists said, well, we don't know, but we hope to get some sort of adaptation funding as a result of going with the train. Now, the trouble, of course, with that is that it's very difficult to get agreement with the United States and China, let's say, on cutting back on greenhouse gases. It's very, very hard to get that kind of agreement. And sadly, they tie the adaptation negotiations to success with the mitigation negotiations. And so if they don't get a deal between the United States and China for cutting greenhouse gases, then the adaptation negotiations fall apart also. And so what we're saying, and the Africans and others in developing countries are starting to say, yeah, we should have separate negotiations for helping people today adapt to climate change. And then if they never get a mitigation agreement, well, at least we're helping them now. And, that's where people, even those who believe that we are causing dangerous climate change, that's where everyone's starting to come together, left, right, and center. They're starting to say, isn't it nutty to be valuing the lives of people who have yet to be born more than those suffering now? That just seems immoral. And so that's where we actually should be able to work together with the environmentalists, independent of the cause of climate change, to help people today.
Tom Harris, stand by, please. Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. Have at him, have at me if you like. 604-280-9898. Agree or disagree with what you're hearing.
This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
All right, speaking with Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. We're talking about climate change, global warming. Is it caused by humans? Can we do anything to prevent it? Give us a call at 604-280-9898, star 9898 on your cell phone, and long distance toll free 1-877-399-9898. Let's go to John in Vancouver. John, hi, go ahead.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, I think it's really arrogant to claim that people can change the climate. Don't we have this big star, not that big, but about 1,000 times or more larger than the Earth, sending us energy 24/7, and it changes there, making changes and globally. I hear this global warming. It's always happening somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, one really important point to realize is that nature changes climate on its own without our help all the time. If you go back 11,000 years, there was a time period where the climate, or the temperature of Earth, warmed more than 10 times faster than it did in the 20th century.
And when was that? Sorry, Tom?
About 11,000 years ago.
Okay.
It was called the Younger Dryas cold episode, and when it warmed up again, it was at least 10 times faster in its warming than what we saw in the 20th century. And, of course, humans were still pretty primitive 11,000 years ago. So there's no question that this is not an unusual rate of climate change that we're experiencing. And also there's no question that nature changes all the time. Every planet with an atmosphere has climate change. Mars does it, all the planets that have atmospheres. So the idea that we are the master control of the universe when it comes to climate is rather silly.
What do you make of this 400 parts per million? I saw that on Twitter a few times again today, that we've crossed this threshold. It's a threshold, 400 parts per million. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, that was a political decision that was made with the various UN bodies that this was a critical temperature or critical carbon dioxide level, and that the target was 350 parts per million. But, there's really no good scientific reason for that. In fact, if you look at the history of the Earth, there were times 440 million years ago, for example, when CO2 levels were 13 times today's levels. In other words, 1,300% of today's levels. And at that time, the Earth was in the coldest period of the last half billion years. There are other times when you had 10 times higher CO2 levels, and the Earth was warm. So there really doesn't seem to be any correlation in the long-term record between CO2 and carbon dioxide.
What is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that comes from humans? Is it less than 1%, as I've read?
Well, it's typically 5%.
5%, okay.
Yeah, that's right, and it varies year to year. One of the things that's interesting is if you actually plot the rate of CO2 change in the atmosphere, it can vary as much as 300%. And yet the amount of change year to year from human emissions is typically around 1%. So nature is quite capable of changing CO2 in our atmosphere all by itself. Okay, the biggest source of CO2 in the atmosphere is emissions from the ocean. Okay, and as the ocean warms, you would expect it to put out carbon dioxide. If you put a can of pop on your counter, it's going to emit carbon dioxide until it's flat, of course, and that's because it's warming up. And that's what oceans do. And so when ocean warms up, the CO2 level will rise in the atmosphere. And what we're finding when you actually look at the record closely is the temperature goes up up to 800 years before the CO2 rises. In other words, the CO2 is rising as a consequence of climate change for whatever reason, but the CO2 is not driving climate change.
What do you make of the UK Met Office saying that there really hasn't been a lot of global warming since, 1998?
Yeah, well, I agree with them. In fact, the satellite records, the surface records, they all show the same thing, that global warming essentially stopped around 1997, actually, if you go back far enough. And the interesting thing is the Met Office is now forecasting that there won't be any more global warming until at least 2018. So by that time, it'll be 22 years with no warming. And the questions people are starting to ask is, how long do you have to have no global warming before you say there's no global warming? I'd say 22 years is a pretty good sample size to dictate, to basically tell us that we're not we're not in a global warming catastrophe.
Well, I tweeted that a few times last time you were on the show, and I was getting some criticism, Tom, because people do take this stuff very seriously. It's almost a religious viewpoint for some people, and I pointed this out, and they said, "Well, our models accounted for that. We knew that was going to happen, and that's because the oceans absorbed more heat than maybe we thought they would. But otherwise, we've accounted for all these factors, and they seem unshakable in their opinion."
Yeah, it's sad because, if we expected the oceans to take up the warming, which is, of course, the latest theory,
yes,
then why didn't they forecast that?
Because their climate models don't work.
Yeah, exactly. And they can't work, okay? This is something people don't realize. It's not a matter of tweaking them a little bit and getting them to work. You see, we do not have a theory of climate, okay? It doesn't exist. All they do is they guess at what they think are reasonable drivers for climate, and then they watch and see what happens. If it doesn't happen the way they guessed, then they go back and change some of the parameters, or they change some of the variables or the equations, but they don't have a basic equation to actually program. And so, Chris Essex from the University of Western Ontario and Ross McKittrick in their book Taken by Storm, he says that not only are we not able to forecast climate, but many experts are actually saying we may never be able to because the science is so unbelievably complicated. If you look in the sky, I'm in a campground right now. I look at the sky and I see clouds, and clouds are a big, big controller of climate, okay? I see these clouds. Can I forecast where they're going to be in even a day? I can't do that because we don't have the mathematics.
There's too many variables. It's like chaos here. You just can't do it.
That's right. And so the idea that we, can forecast climate and the idea that we can control it, really, it's crazy. You hear some people like David Keith, who used to be with the University of Calgary, talking about geoengineering, where they're going to control the planet's climate by monkeying around with, making clouds artificially with sulfates or maybe having big solar shades or things like that. To me, that's like giving a 5-year-old a tool set and taking the back off your TV and saying, here, fix the TV. You probably killed a child, but you certainly wouldn't get the TV fixed because they don't know how it works. And that's the point. Until we understand how nature drives climate, the idea that we can tease out of the data the human influence is really a fairy tale.
604-280-9898. Just a few minutes left for calls to Tom Harris. Nick in Surrey. Hi, Nick. Go ahead.
Hey, Sean. This guy is great. I've long agreed with everything he said, and right from the very beginning, my brother is a teacher, a science teacher, and I knew that the human component of CO2 was insignificant. You can't, like Tom said, it's all coming from the oceans. But what's really happening here is that the liberal media and the liberal elite that are driving this issue, it's all about a financial crisis, not a global warming crisis. And if they can get you arguing about these small details, then they obfuscate what's really going on. And it's all about taxes and money. It was simply a way to fleece money out of the public.
Wealth redistribution, Nick, sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why most of the money goes into climate mitigation, not into climate adaptation. If you think about it, big companies like General Electric make a great deal of money on wind turbines. The companies that are doing the research and work on carbon sequestration, carbon trading. There's a lot of money to be made in this idea that we can stop climate change. But when you actually put boots on the ground and you actually try to help poor people in the developing world, not a lot of money to be made there. A lot of impact, of course. You can help people for sure. But I think that's the real driver behind the climate scare.
We have about a minute left, Tom. I want to ask you about the infamous quote from James Hansen, no longer with NASA, but one of the most well-known climate scientists in the world, who says, if the tar sands in Canada is fully exploited, it is game over. Game over, he says, Tom.
Yeah, well, of course, even if the theory of anthropogenic climate change were true, even if we were the dominant cause of climate change, the amount of CO2 that comes out from the oil sands fully right now is a little over 0.1%. Okay, if they doubled it, tripled it, quadrupled it, even if you believe that we're the cause of climate change, China would swamp that impact in a couple of days because they're opening a new coal station every week. So that really doesn't make any sense what he said.
Tom Harris, always great to have you on the show. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. If you couldn't get through, send me an email, sleslie@cknw.com.